Forget everything you've seen in the movies. Erase that gauzy, soft-focus image of the witty, empowered courtesan tossing off a clever sonnet before tumbling into bed with a handsome duke. Banish the thought of a woman who chose her profession like an artist chooses a canvas, a free agent navigating a man's world with nothing but a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. That's the lie we tell ourselves because the truth is so much filthier, so much more drenched in sweat and desperation. The reality of the Venetian courtesan, the supposed queen of the Adriatic, was a frantic daily negotiation between splendor and squalor, a tightrope walk over a canal filled with equal parts gold coin and raw sewage. They weren't poets who happened to sell their bodies. They were sex workers who had to learn poetry to raise their price. The glamour was a mask, and underneath it, the skin was often rotting away. We love the myth, don't we? The idea of the cortigiana honesta, the honest courtesan, a woman of dazzling intellect and refined manners who offered elite men a fantasy of companionship that their pious, boring wives couldn't provide. She could discuss Petrarch, debate philosophy, play the lute, and do it all while looking like a Titian painting come to life. And yes, some of them could. A very, very small and very, very lucky few. But for every Veronica Franco penning defiant verses, there were 1,000 anonymous women whose only verses were the grunts and moans of men whose names they'd forget by morning. Their primary skill wasn't rhetoric. It was learning how to fake a convincing moan while mentally calculating if the bastard was going to short them on the payment. Their greatest intellectual achievement wasn't a perfectly structured couplet. It was figuring out which back-alley crone sold the least lethal abortifacient. This isn't a story of empowerment. This is a story of a meat market with good marketing. Venice in the Renaissance was the Las Vegas of its day, a gaudy, glittering hub of commerce, carnival, and calculated sin. A city of merchants who knew the price of everything, especially a soul. And in this city, the courtesan was both a luxury good and a public utility. The state, those pious old men of the Council of Ten, simultaneously condemned them for their immorality and taxed them for their earnings. They were a vital part of the tourist economy, a reason for foreign dignitaries and merchants to linger, to spend their money, to get their pockets emptied in more ways than one. The city needed them, profited from them, and despised them in equal measure. They were walking, talking, breathing paradoxes of filth and finery. Imagine being celebrated as the pinnacle of beauty and culture one moment, and then being legally required to wear a specific coloured scarf so everyone knew you were a whore the next. That was the gig. A gilded cage where the bars were made of silk and the floor was smeared with blood and mercury. So let's peel back the layers of perfume and propaganda and get to the stinking, throbbing, glorious and grotesque heart of the matter. We're going to talk about the real business of pleasure in a city built on water, a city that was always in danger of sinking under the weight of its own beautiful, hypocritical bullshit. But before we bow to our historical overlords, I need to know who's in my little army of degenerates. Sound off in the comments. What patch of earth are you on, and what's the time on your sundial? Let me know who's ready to watch the powerful get filthy. All right, let's bend the knee for now. The day for a Venetian courtesan didn't begin with a lover's gentle kiss or a leisurely breakfast. It began with work, the brutal, unglamorous, and often painful work of constructing a goddess from mortal, flawed, and increasingly damaged flesh. This wasn't a 5-minute makeup routine. This was a multi-hour alchemical ritual of self-erasure, a process of slathering, plucking, poisoning, and perfuming oneself into a marketable commodity. Let's start with the hair, that famous Titian red or sun-bleached blonde that cascaded in soft waves in all the paintings. You think that was natural? Don't be a fool. Achieving that perfect shade was an ordeal. a woman would ascend to the altana, a special wooden rooftop terrace, with her hair drenched in a corrosive slurry. The recipe varied, but it was usually a vile concoction of rock alum, black sulphur, and honey, or sometimes, more simply, horse urine left to ferment in the sun. She'd put on a special wide-brimmed, crownless hat called a solana, pulling her sticky, chemical-drenched locks through the top and spreading them out over the brim to bake for hours under the relentless Italian sun. The process was itchy, smelly, and it fried the hair, leaving it brittle and weak. But it produced the colour her clients and the artists they commissioned demanded. It was the first layer of the lie. Hair the colour of sunlight, achieved through a process that felt like a penance. While the hair cooked, the skin demanded its own pound of flesh. The ideal was a face of pure, luminous white, a sign of aristocracy that screamed, "I don't work in the fields." For a courtesan, it was essential. It separated her from the sun-darkened streetwalkers and projected an image of untouchable purity, which was, of course, the whole ironic point. To get this deathly pallor, they used Venetian ceruse, a foundation made from white lead mixed with vinegar. They would slather this thick, toxic paste over their face, neck, and chest, creating a smooth, porcelain-like mask. It was incredibly effective at hiding blemishes, smallpox scars, and the subtle signs of syphilis. It was also quite literally poison. The lead was absorbed through the skin, leading to a host of horrifying side effects over time: hair loss, tooth decay, muscle paralysis, madness, and a slow, agonizing death. Every morning a woman would paint her own face with her eventual killer. She would look in her polished metal mirror and see a perfect pale vision, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the beautiful mask was eating the face beneath. Was it worth it? Ask the woman whose teeth were so loose she could only eat soup, but whose flawless complexion still commanded the highest price in the city. Her answer would probably be a weary, lead-laced sigh. And the eyes, oh, the eyes had to be perfect. They needed to be large, dark, and liquid, pools of feigned innocence and promised carnality. The secret to this was belladonna, the juice of the deadly nightshade plant. A few drops in each eye would dilate the pupils to an enormous size, creating a look of perpetual, wide-eyed arousal. It made the world a little blurry, a little soft-focused, which was perhaps a blessing, given what she had to look at all day. But belladonna, like ceruse, came with a price. Used repeatedly, it caused visual distortions, sensitivity to light, and eventually permanent blindness. So you have this emerging portrait of our queen. Her hair is fried, her skin is absorbing poison, and her eyes are slowly losing their ability to see. And we haven't even gotten to hygiene yet. The very concept of a daily bath was foreign. Water, especially the foul water of the canals, was seen as a carrier of disease. So cleanliness was a matter of dabbing, scraping, and perfuming. A sponge bath with scented water perhaps, but the real work happened inside. The fear of pregnancy and disease was constant, and the methods to combat them were a witch's brew of folklore and butchery. A courtesan would perform a daily douche, not with a gentle, pH-balanced solution, but with harsh astringents like lye, alum, or vinegar, sometimes even infusing wine with herbs, believing it would wash away sin and seed in equal measure. These concoctions were brutally effective at destroying the delicate internal ecosystem, leading to chronic infections, inflammation, and infertility. In a bitter twist, the very act of trying to remain clean and available for work often rendered a woman sterile, which, in the cold calculus of her profession, might have been considered a long-term benefit. It saved her the trouble and danger of a back-alley abortion later. The body was a temple, yes, but it was a temple under constant, violent renovation, with the scaffolding threatening to collapse at any moment. Every part of her preparation was a small act of self-harm, a trade-off of future health for present income. She was erasing herself, molecule by molecule, to create an illusion that a rich man could purchase for a few hours. The scent of her expensive Persian perfume barely masked the chemical tang of her hair, the metallic hint of her makeup, and the faint, ever-present odor of her own slow decay. This was the cost of being beautiful. This was the price of being a queen. The final touches were a matter of public advertising and personal branding. Rouge, made from cochineal or vermilion, was daubed on the cheeks and lips, a slash of vibrant color against the stark white of the ceruse. It was a signal of life, of passion, in a face that was becoming a death mask. Sometimes, for a bit of flair, she might apply a small black patch of velvet or silk, a mouche, to her face or breast. It could hide a pockmark, sure, but its placement was a coded language. A patch by the eye meant, "I am passionate," one by the lips, "I am flirtatious," and one on the breast, "I am generous." It was a tiny, silent billboard advertising the evening's menu. Her breasts themselves would be pushed up and forward by a tightly laced corset designed to present them as two perfect offerings on a platter. The final act was dressing. The sumptuary laws of Venice were strict, intended to maintain a clear visual distinction between the social classes. Nobles had their prescribed fabrics and colors, citizens theirs. Courtesans, in their own special category of tolerated filth, were often forbidden from wearing silk, but they found ways around it. They would wear gowns of dazzling color and cut, often with a low neckline that plunged to the navel, and they dripped with jewels, gifts from patrons, investments in their own brand. They were walking advertisements for their own success, but they were also marked. Officially, they were sometimes required to wear yellow scarves or blouses as a badge of their trade, a mark of shame to separate them from respectable women. The most successful ones, of course, flaunted these rules, paying the fines as a cost of doing business. Their very existence was an act of defiance against the city's hypocrisy. They were told to be invisible, and yet their survival depended on being spectacularly, unforgettably visible. The entire preparation was a war fought on the battlefield of the body, a war against nature, against time, against disease, and against the state. By the time she was ready to receive her first visitor of the evening, the woman was gone, and the courtesan, a beautiful, fragile, poisonous work of art, was ready for her close-up. She was a masterpiece of self-destruction, a walking memento mori, and the most sought-after product in Venice. And the show was just about to begin. The sheer exhaustion of this preparation, the hours spent in painful, toxic self-modification, must have been immense. It's a level of commitment that makes a modern-day influencer's Get Ready With Me video look like child's play. This wasn't about looking good, it was about looking like a living fantasy, a creature not of this world, precisely so that men of this world would pay a fortune to possess her, if only for a night. The psychological toll of this daily transformation is hard to fathom. To spend half your day becoming someone else, a perfect, pleasing object, must erode the sense of self until all that's left is the performance. The real woman, the one with the aching back from the sunbaking and the raw skin from the lye douche, was buried so deep under the paint and perfume that perhaps even she had trouble finding herself anymore. Now let's talk about where this elaborate performance took place. The stage for this nightly drama wasn't always the opulent, silk-draped boudoir you're picturing. The environment was as much a part of the transaction as the woman herself, a carefully calibrated setting designed to reinforce the fantasy while often hiding a much grimmer reality. The very architecture of Venice, a city of impossible beauty and underlying decay, was the perfect metaphor for the courtesan's life. A successful courtesan might indeed have a lavish apartment in a palazzo, but it was rarely her own. It was rented, often at an exorbitant price, and paid for by her primary patron. This apartment was her showroom, her office, and her prison. The front rooms, the ones a visitor would first see, would be a testament to her success. You'd find Turkish carpets, silver candlesticks, a lute resting artfully in a corner, and perhaps a small, caged songbird, another beautiful thing trapped for its master's pleasure. The walls might be hung with tapestries or gilded leather, not just for beauty, but to provide a crucial layer of insulation against the damp, chilling cold that seeped up from the canals and through the stone walls. The furniture would be heavy, dark and ornately carved, meant to impress, to scream wealth and taste. A visitor would be offered wine from a Murano glass goblet, a delicate, beautiful thing that could shatter with the slightest pressure. Sound familiar? But this was all just the facade. Peel back the tapestry, and you'd find crumbling, mould-streaked plaster. The grandeur was a thin veneer over a structure that was slowly, inevitably, sinking into the lagoon. The sensory atmosphere was an overwhelming assault, a deliberate cocktail mixed to intoxicate and disorient. The first thing that would hit you wasn't the sight of beauty, but the smell. A thick, cloying cloud of perfume would hang in the air, a desperate attempt to conquer the city's pervasive stench. Venice, for all its beauty, stank. It was a city without a modern sewer system, where waste was simply tossed into the canals. In the heat of summer, the smell of human and animal filth, rotting garbage and stagnant water was a physical presence. Inside the courtesans' rooms, this foundational stink was buried under layers of expensive imported incense, burning scented oils, and the woman's own heavy perfume. The resulting aroma was a bizarre and heady mix of the sacred and the profane, ambergris and rosewater fighting a losing battle against mildew and decay. The sounds were just as layered. From the canal outside, you'd hear the gentle lapping of water against stone, the mournful cry of a gondolier, a snatch of a distant song. Inside, there would be the carefully chosen music, the soft strumming of the lute, the tinkle of a spinet, designed to soothe and seduce. But beneath that there was always the creak of the floorboards, the scuttling of rats in the walls, and the muffled shouts and laughter from other, less refined parties in the same building. The light was always dim, always flattering. Heavy brocade curtains would block out the harsh light of day, and at night the rooms would be lit by dozens of beeswax candles. The flickering light softened features, hid the cracks in the plaster and the finer lines on the courtesan's face. It created a world of shadow and suggestion, a dreamscape where a transaction could feel like a romance. It was all a carefully managed illusion, a theatre of seduction where every prop had its part to play. But what about the tools of the trade? Let's move past the romantic props and into the grimy mechanics of the business. The bed, the central altar of this temple, was often less luxurious than you'd think. It might have a grand carved headboard, but the mattress would be stuffed with lumpy straw or horsehair, a breeding ground for fleas and lice. The silken sheets, you imagine, were a rare luxury. More often it was coarse linen, washed infrequently in the same canal water that carried the city's waste. Tucked away, out of sight, was the real equipment. A basin and ewer, of course, for the perfunctory washing, but next to them a collection of vials and jars containing the tools of survival, the lead-based makeup, the belladonna drops, jars of mercury ointment, the preferred, agonizing, and ultimately useless treatment for the pox. Potions and tinctures from the local apothecary, guaranteed to prevent conception or induce a miscarriage, their ingredients a terrifying mystery. There were sponges used as a primitive form of diaphragm, often soaked in vinegar or other acidic substances. There were syringes made of pewter or glass for the ritual douching. These weren't instruments of pleasure. They were the grim, necessary tools of occupational health and safety, 16th century style. They were hidden away because they shattered the illusion. The client was paying for a goddess, not a woman who had to scrape mercury into her open sores after he left. The symbolic meaning of this environment is impossible to miss. It was a perfect reflection of the courtesan's precarious position. The opulence was borrowed, conditional on her ability to please. The decay was her own, a constant reminder of the physical cost of her life. The entire setup was designed to reinforce the power dynamic. The client entered a world built entirely for his pleasure. He was the audience, the critic, and the patron, all in one. The courtesan was the performer, the stage manager, and the stage itself. The transactional nature of the encounter was baked into the very walls. The expensive carpets, the fine wine, the artful music, all of it was part of the price of admission. It was a package deal, a luxury experience. He wasn't just paying for sex. He was paying to inhabit a fantasy for a few hours. He was paying for the privilege of being in a place where the ugliness of the real world, the smells, the sickness, the poverty, was temporarily masked by a beautiful, expensive lie. For the women who lived there, however, there was no escaping the reality. For them, the beautiful room was a workplace. The luxurious bed was a factory floor. The scent of roses was just another way to hide the smell of the rot, and the constant creaking of the old palazzo was a reminder that everything, from the city to their own bodies, was slowly, inexorably sinking. The contrast between the front room and the back room, the public space and the private one, was the defining feature of her existence. One was for show, for art, for commerce. The other was for the messy, painful, biological reality of the work. And the most successful courtesan was the one who could keep that backroom door firmly, firmly shut. At least until the client had paid and gone home to his respectable wife, leaving the queen of the night to deal with the stains on the linen and the poison seeping into her blood. Now let's pull back the curtain on the men in charge, because in this glittering, sinking city, a woman, no matter how clever or beautiful, was never truly her own master. She was a pawn in a complex game of power, manipulated by forces both intimately personal and coldly bureaucratic. To understand the courtesan's life is to understand who held the leash. And there were always at least two hands on it. First, you have the most immediate authority figure, the patron. He wasn't just a client, he was an investor. The most successful courtesans didn't survive on a string of one-night stands. They secured a long-term arrangement with a wealthy protector, a rich merchant, or a foreign nobleman who would pay her rent, buy her extravagant clothes, and essentially keep her on retainer. This relationship was a deeply twisted parody of marriage. The patron offered financial security, a shield from the dangers of the street, and a veneer of social standing. In return, he demanded exclusivity, or at least the illusion of it. He owned her time, her body, and her public image. She was his ultimate status symbol, more impressive than a fine horse or a big diamond. Parading his beautiful, intelligent mistress at parties was a way of showing off his wealth and sophistication to his rivals. "Look at what I can afford," her presence screamed. "Look at the quality of conversation and flesh I command." The hypocrisy of this arrangement was staggering. The very same patrician who kept a courtesan in a lavish apartment would go home to his devout, cloistered wife, demanding absolute fidelity and piety from her. He existed in two parallel worlds, the respectable world of family, church, and state, and the shadow world of the brothel and the boudoir. His power over the courtesan was near absolute. He could be generous and kind, treating her as a cherished companion, or he could be cruel and demanding, a tyrant in the bedroom. A word from him could ruin her reputation. A withdrawal of his funds could cast her out onto the street in an instant. She had to be a master psychologist, constantly reading his moods, anticipating his desires, and soothing his ego. Her survival depended on her ability to maintain his interest and his generosity. It was a performance that never ended. Was he in love with her? Maybe. Was she in love with him? Almost certainly not. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. What she felt was a calculated dependency, a tightrope walker's focus on the man holding the safety net. He was her landlord, her employer, and her warden, all rolled into one. And he could fire her at any time, for any reason, a new wrinkle, a new rival, or simple, brutal boredom. But the patron wasn't the ultimate authority. Looming over everyone in Venice, from the doge to the lowliest beggar, was the state, specifically the cold, calculating bureaucracy of the Council of Ten and the health magistrates, the provveditori alla sanità. These were the men who truly held the power, and their relationship with the city's courtesans was a masterpiece of institutional hypocrisy. On one hand, they publicly condemned prostitution as a moral evil, a cancer on the soul of their Christian republic. The church thundered against the daughters of Eve, and the government passed endless performative laws to control them. These were the infamous sumptuary laws we mentioned, dictating what they could wear, where they could live, and how they could appear in public. They were designed to shame and segregate, to draw a clear line between the honorable women of Venice and these fallen creatures. But it was all a show, because on the other hand, the state was the largest pimp in the city. They understood that the sex trade was a massive economic engine. It brought in tourists, it kept foreign sailors and merchants happy and spending, and most importantly, it was taxable. The government levied heavy taxes on prostitutes, creating a direct financial incentive to let the trade flourish as long as it remained somewhat orderly. In 1509, one official census listed over 11,000 prostitutes in a city of around 150,000 people. You don't have that many people in a single profession unless the system, at some level, allows and encourages it. The state's power was impersonal and absolute. They could issue an order and a woman's life could be upended. The health magistrates, for instance, were tasked with controlling the spread of the French pox, or syphilis. Their methods were less about public health and more about social control. They could force women to undergo humiliating public inspections. They could quarantine them in pest houses, which were essentially prisons from which few emerged. They could banish them from the city, stripping them of their home and livelihood in a single stroke. This created a constant, low-level hum of terror in the life of every courtesan. Her patron might be fickle, but the state was forever. She was caught in a perfect trap. To succeed, she had to be visible, beautiful, and desirable, attracting the wealthiest patrons. But the more visible and successful she became, the more she attracted the attention of the state, with its endless regulations, taxes, and the ever-present threat of punishment. The relationship was symbiotic and predatory. The state fed on the revenue she generated while simultaneously holding the power to devour her if she stepped out of line. So, who was really in charge? It was a constant, shifting negotiation. On any given night, the patron held the power of the purse. He could demand, and she had to comply. But his power was temporary. The real power lay with the silent, faceless men in the Doge's palace, the ones who wrote the laws and collected the taxes. They were the architects of the system that allowed a man to condemn a woman for her sins in public while enjoying them in private. They created a city where a woman's body could be a celebrated work of art and a taxable commodity at the very same time. The courtesan had to navigate this treacherous landscape every single day. She had to be a brilliant actress for her patron, a savvy businesswoman for her accounts, and a ghost to the authorities. She had to project an image of power and control, all while knowing that she was utterly, terrifyingly powerless. She was a queen on a throne of rotting wood, and the men who had built it could set it on fire whenever they pleased. Her only real power was the knowledge that these men, from the richest merchant to the most pious senator, needed what she sold. They needed the release, the fantasy, the escape from the rigid structures they themselves had created. And in that need, in that shared, dirty little secret, she found the sliver of leverage that allowed her to survive. For a little while, anyway. Now, before the first candle is lit and the first glass of wine is poured, let's crawl inside the mind of the participants. What did they actually believe? We can't understand the grotesque theatre of the Venetian night without understanding the psychological scenery, the bizarre and contradictory tapestry of faith, superstition, and raw justification that hung in the back of every mind. This wasn't a secular, modern transaction. This was an act freighted with the weight of eternal damnation, folk magic, and deeply ingrained beliefs about the filthiness of the human body. Let's start with the courtesan herself. She was almost certainly a product of a deeply Catholic society. From birth, she would have been steeped in the language of sin and redemption, heaven and hell. The Church taught that her work was a mortal sin, that every paid embrace was another step on the road to eternal fire. How do you square that with your daily life? The answer is a masterpiece of psychological gymnastics. Many courtesans practiced a kind of spiritual compartmentalization. The work was the work. The soul was separate. They would be lavish donors to the very churches that condemned them, paying for masses to be said for their souls, buying expensive candles to burn for the Virgin Mary, as if piety could be purchased like any other commodity. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was a desperate form of spiritual insurance. They would pray for forgiveness even as they prepared for the sin, a ritual of repentance before the crime. Veronica Franco herself wrote poems grappling with this duality, casting her profession as a form of painful servitude she was forced into, a cross she had to bear. It was a way of externalizing the blame, of seeing herself as a victim of circumstance rather than an active sinner. This allowed her to maintain a sense of self, a core of goodness that was separate from the bad things her body had to do. This spiritual tightrope act was exhausting. Imagine the psychic dissonance of listening to a sermon about the evils of fornication on Sunday morning and then welcoming a senator into your bed on Sunday night. It required a level of self-deception that is both tragic and profoundly human. They created a personal theology of survival, one where God would surely understand that a woman had to eat. He was a forgiving God, after all, especially to those who could afford to make generous donations in His name. This cynical piety was a cornerstone of her internal world, a necessary fiction to keep from going mad. Then you have the swirling cesspool of folk medicine and superstition that governed their understanding of the body. This was an age before germ theory, when disease was understood as an imbalance of the four humours, a punishment from God, or a form of malicious witchcraft. The French pox, syphilis, was a terrifying mystery. Its origins were blamed on foreigners, on celestial alignments, on blasphemy. Its symptoms, the hideous rashes, the open sores, the rotting of the nose and palate, the eventual descent into madness, were seen as a visible manifestation of inner corruption. The cures were just as terrifying. The most common was mercury, ingested as a pill or rubbed into the skin as an ointment. It caused profuse drooling, which was thought to be the body expelling the disease. In reality, it was a symptom of severe heavy metal poisoning, which destroyed the nervous system and led to a slow, agonizing death. A courtesan lived in mortal terror of the pox. A single chancre could be a death sentence, not just medically, but professionally. Her entire livelihood depended on the illusion of health and cleanliness, so they turned to a wild array of superstitious protections. They might wear an amulet made from a toad's bone, believing it would ward off illness. They would follow complex rituals before and after each client, involving specific prayers or incantations. Beliefs about conception were equally bizarre. It was thought that a woman's pleasure was necessary for conception to occur, a convenient fiction that placed the blame for an unwanted pregnancy squarely on her. They believed that the position of the stars, the phase of the moon, or even the thoughts a woman had during the act could influence the outcome. To prevent pregnancy, they relied on a frightening pharmacopoeia of folk remedies passed down from other women, consuming herbs like pennyroyal or tansy, which were toxic in high doses, using pessaries made of crocodile dung or acacia honey, or even holding their breath at the critical moment. These methods were, of course, wildly ineffective and often dangerous. The psychological landscape was one of constant, low-grade terror, a fear of forces, divine and biological, that she could neither understand nor control. Every itch, every rash, every missed period was a potential catastrophe. Her body was a battlefield, and she was fighting a war with prayers, poisons, and wishful thinking. And what about the client? What was his psychological justification? The patrician, the merchant, the visiting cardinal, they were all products of the same Catholic culture. They knew they were sinning. So how did they live with themselves? First, there was the ancient, powerful idea of the double standard. A man's lust was seen as a natural, uncontrollable force, a biological imperative that needed an outlet. Wives were for procreation and maintaining the family line. They were meant to be pure, chaste, and passionless. To sully one's wife with excessive or unnatural lust was considered a sin in itself. Therefore, the logic went, a man needed a safe place to dispose of his sinful urges. The courtesan, being already fallen, was the perfect vessel. In a twisted way, visiting her was seen as an act that protected the sanctity of his own home and the purity of his wife. He was quarantining his own filth. It was a necessary evil, a pressure valve for the city's libido. This neat piece of moral logic allowed him to walk out of the courtesan's bedroom and into Sunday Mass with a clear conscience, or at least one that could be cleared with a few coins in the collection plate. Furthermore, the experience was framed not merely as sex, but as an act of cultural refinement. He wasn't just a John, he was a patron of the arts. He was appreciating a woman's wit, her music, her conversation. The sex was just part of a larger, more sophisticated package. This elevated the sordid transaction into something noble. It allowed him to feel like a Medici, a connoisseur of beauty in all its forms rather than just a man paying to get his rocks off. He could justify the expense and the moral compromise by telling himself it was an educational, even an aesthetic, experience. It was the ultimate, it's not porn, it's a European art film argument. This justification was crucial. It separated him from the common slob who visited a cheap dockside whore. He was participating in a higher form of commerce, a union of mind and body. It was, of course, utter bullshit. He was there because he was horny and had money, but the human mind is a genius at weaving beautiful lies around ugly truths. And in the perfumed, candle-lit rooms of Venice, these lies were the most valuable commodity of all. For both the woman selling her body and the man buying it, the entire encounter was buffered by a thick, protective layer of self-deception. It was a shared delusion, a conspiracy of justification that allowed the gears of the city's pleasure machine to grind on, night after miserable night. The moment arrives, the carefully constructed artifice, the hours of preparation, the psychological gymnastics. It all leads to this, the first point of contact. This is not the passionate, sweeping embrace of a romance novel. This is a business meeting disguised as a seduction, a moment tense with assessment, calculation, and the potential for everything to go horribly, horribly wrong. The patron, let's call him Signore Bastiano, a portly silk merchant with sweating palms and an ego as inflated as his purse, is announced. He stomps up the stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the stone passageway. Already slightly drunk on cheap wine, he'll later brag, was the finest vintage. The courtesan, let's call her Fiammetta, rises to greet him. Her smile is a masterpiece of engineering, bright and welcoming, revealing none of the contempt she feels for the way he wipes his greasy mouth on the back of his sleeve. The first few minutes are a carefully choreographed dance. He will present a small gift, a bauble, a book of poetry, a few coins, which she must receive with breathless, girlish delight, as if she has never seen such wonders. This is the opening bid, the initial testing of the waters. His generosity here will set the tone for the rest of the night. She, in turn, will offer him wine in her finest Murano glass, pouring it with a steady hand despite the slight tremor of anxiety. Is he in a good mood? Is he drunker than usual? Does he look like he's spoiling for a fight or a quick brutish tumble? Every glance, every word is data. She is a spy in the house of lust. The conversation begins, and it is a performance worthy of the stage. She will ask about his latest shipment of silk from the Levant, feigning a deep and abiding interest in thread counts and profit margins. She will compliment his new doublet, his wit, well, she'll find something to compliment, even if it's just the polish on his shoes. She might recite a bit of Petrarch, something she memorized that morning, her voice soft and melodic. This is the honest courtesan part of the show, the intellectual appetizer before the main course. It's designed to reinforce his belief that he is not with a common whore, but a woman of substance. It justifies the high price he is about to pay. Bastiano, for his part, laps it up. He fancies himself a man of culture, and Fiammetta's performance confirms his self-image. He puffs out his chest, corrects her, wrongly, on a point of philosophy, and tells a bawdy joke he heard in the Rialto market, passing it off as his own invention. She laughs, a sound like silver bells, a laugh she has practiced in the mirror 1,000 times. It's all so civilized, so refined, but underneath the surface, a different negotiation is taking place. His eyes keep straying to the low-cut neckline of her gown. His hand, as he gestures, brushes against her arm, lingering just a second too long. The air, thick with perfume and wine fumes, begins to charge with a different kind of energy. The pretense of intellectual companionship is wearing thin, like a cheap piece of silk. The initial shock, the first real crack in the facade, often comes with a sudden, clumsy gesture. He reaches out, no longer feigning accident, and grabs her wrist. His grip is too tight. His breath, sour with wine and garlic, is hot on her cheek. "Enough of this poetry," he might grunt, his voice suddenly thick and guttural. "I've paid for a woman, not a lecture." And just like that, the illusion shatters. The scholar vanishes and the John appears. Fiammetta's smile doesn't falter, but her body tenses. This is the pivot, the moment the power dynamic shifts from a delicate dance to a crude transaction. All the poetry, all the music, all the refined conversation was just foreplay, and not for the act of sex, but for the act of payment. Now the real work begins. The clumsiness is often the most shocking part. We imagine these encounters as a kind of dark, elegant ballet, but the reality was often a fumbling, awkward mess. Bastiano, his senses dulled by wine, might trip on the edge of the Turkish carpet. He might spill his drink down the front of her expensive rented gown. His attempts at seduction are not the smooth maneuvers of a practiced lover, but the brutish pawing of a man who believes he has purchased the right to be clumsy, to be crude, to be himself. The shock for Fiammetta isn't the man's desire, it's the sheer ugliness of it. It's the moment she sees the slack-jawed lust in his eyes, the same look she's seen on 1,000 other faces, and realizes that all her wit and learning mean nothing. He doesn't see a poet or a musician. He sees a hole to put his money in and then another hole to put himself in. This is the first point of real physical contact, and it is rarely gentle. It is a proprietary grab, a gesture that says, "You are mine for the next hour." The shock is in the reduction of her entire, carefully constructed persona to a piece of meat. The woman who spent hours poisoning herself to look like a goddess is suddenly just a body, an object to be used. And the client, who was playing the part of the sophisticated patron, reveals himself to be just another man driven by a need so common, so animal, that it strips him of all his borrowed finery. The transition to the bedroom is a study in controlled chaos. She must guide him, this lumbering, drunken bull, from the salon to the bed without betraying her disgust or her fear. She must maintain the illusion of willing participation, of shared desire. Her movements are fluid and practiced, a stark contrast to his oafish stumbling. She will whisper encouragement, praise his passion, all while her mind is racing. Is the door locked? Are her other appointments for the night taken care of? Where did she hide the knife she keeps for emergencies? The initial shock is not a single event, but a rapid cascade of small humiliations. It's the smell of his unwashed body as he pulls her close. It's the feeling of his calloused, dirty hands on the skin she spent hours bleaching and softening. It's the sound of his ragged breathing, a sound that has nothing to do with passion and everything to do with exertion and entitlement. All her illusions about control, about being the master of this game, evaporate in this moment. She is not in control. The man with the money is in control. Her only power lies in her ability to endure, to perform, and to make him believe he is getting exactly what he paid for. The first 5 minutes of the encounter are the most dangerous and the most crucial. It's where the fantasy she sells collides with the reality he brings with him. And in that collision, the carefully painted mask of the honest courtesan is cracked, revealing the grim, terrified face of a worker just trying to get through her shift without being broken. The first touch is not a caress, it's a branding iron. Once the fragile veneer of civility has been shattered, the encounter descends into the real business of the evening, the grinding, messy, and deeply unromantic slog of the act itself. This is the part that the poems and paintings leave out. This is the part that is all sweat, strain, and silent calculation. Forget passion, forget ecstasy. This is manual labor. This is a performance under the most intimate and demanding of conditions, and the stage is a lumpy, flea-bitten mattress. The midpoint slog is not about a singular moment of pleasure, but about the sustained, often tedious, and sometimes horrifying duration of the job. For Fiammetta, our courtesan, the world shrinks to the size of the bed. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of survival, goes into a state of hyper-aware detachment. She is both participant and observer, her body moving in practiced, pleasing rhythms, while her brain runs a constant, frantic commentary. Is he enjoying this? Good. The more he enjoys it, the more likely he is to pay extra. Is he hurting me? A little. I can tolerate it. That bruise will be hidden by my sleeve tomorrow. How much longer will this take? God, I hope he's quick. I have the fishmonger's son coming at midnight, and he always pays on time. The sensory details are overwhelming and grotesque. The close-up reality is a far cry from the soft focus fantasy. The air, already thick with stale perfume, is now filled with the rank, animal smells of two laboring bodies, the stench of Signore Bastiano's unwashed sweat, the sourness of the wine on his breath, the faint, cheesy odor of his feet. All of this mingles with her own, more delicate, but equally present, bodily sense. The sounds are not the symphony of lovemaking you hear in movies. They are a clumsy, arrhythmic collection of grunts, wet slaps of skin on skin, the frantic creaking of the bed ropes straining under the weight, and the rustle of the straw mattress. And over it all, Fiammetta provides the soundtrack. She has a whole repertoire of moans, from the soft, breathy sigh of nascent pleasure to the full-throated cry of fabricated ecstasy. It's a performance she has honed over years. She knows which sounds drive a man to finish faster, which ones soothe a fragile ego, and which ones sound convincing enough to earn a bonus. Her moans are a tool, as functional and impersonal as a hammer. While she is making these sounds of supposed passion, her face, turned away from his, is a mask of bored concentration, like a factory worker on an assembly line. The anatomical reality is a comedy of errors and horrors. This is not the union of two perfect sculpted bodies. This is the messy collision of flawed human flesh. Bastiano is overweight, his belly pressing down on her. He is clumsy, inexpert, and focused solely on his own gratification. The act itself is a series of awkward negotiations. He wants her in a position that is uncomfortable, even painful. She must subtly guide him towards something more tolerable without bruising his ego. "Ah, my lord, you are so strong," she might whisper, while gently shifting her weight. "But let me try this. I have heard it brings a man to the heights of paradise." It's a constant, delicate manipulation, using flattery as a lever to achieve a baseline of physical safety. She is acutely aware of every part of her body and his. Is that a sore on his lip? Is that a strange rash on his thigh? Every encounter is a spin of the roulette wheel of disease. She can try to protect herself with her sponges and her corrosive douches, but she knows deep down that it's a matter of luck. The fear of contracting the pox is a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach, a fear she has to actively suppress in order to do her job. This grinding middle part of the encounter is also where the intimacy becomes truly terrifying. It's not the intimacy of love, but the intimacy of inspection. He has paid for her body, and he feels entitled to examine his purchase. His hands will roam, not with tenderness, but with a kind of drunken, proprietary curiosity. He might comment on her body as if she were a piece of livestock, praising one part, criticizing another. "Your skin is so smooth here," he might say, and in the same breath, "You're getting a bit soft around the middle, Fiammetta." Each comment is a tiny cut, a reminder of her status as a product whose value is in constant decline. She has to absorb these comments with a smile, turning them into a joke, all the while feeling a surge of cold rage. This is the true horror of the job, the complete and total surrender of her physical autonomy. For this hour, her body is not her own. It is a landscape for him to explore, to use, to judge. The psychological toll of this sustained objectification is immense. To get through it, she retreats into the fortress of her mind. She might plan her budget for the next week. She might mentally compose a scathing poem about the fat, sweating pig currently on top of her. She might think about the small house in the countryside she dreams of buying one day, a dream that feels impossibly distant in these moments. This mental escape is her only real freedom. The slog continues. Time seems to stretch and distort. A few minutes can feel like an eternity. She is a clock watcher, measuring the encounter, not in pleasure, but in endurance. She knows the signs, the quickening of his breath, the tensing of his muscles. She knows how to push him over the edge, a subtle shift of her hips, a perfectly timed gasp. It's a science, and when the moment finally comes, it is not a shared climax, but a messy, anticlimactic conclusion to a business deal. His release is her relief. The weight is lifted. The noise stops. For a blissful second, there is silence, broken only by his ragged panting and the continued, mournful creak of the bed. The slog is over. The performance is done. But the work is not. The most humiliating part of the night is often yet to come. The grinding chaos of the act is just the prelude to the cold, awkward reality of the aftermath. And in that quiet, sticky silence, all the ugliness of the transaction comes rushing back in, filling the room with a shame so thick you could choke on it. Of course, it doesn't always go according to plan. The well-oiled machine of the courtesan's trade had 1,000 points of failure, 1,000 ways for a carefully managed evening to spiral into humiliation, violence, or just pathetic, awkward comedy. The inevitable downfall, the moment it all goes wrong, is a key chapter in the unwritten manual of this profession. It's the part that punctures any lingering fantasy of control, revealing the raw, unpredictable, and often dangerous nature of the work. One of the most common failures was simple, biological anticlimax. Signore Bastiano, our silk merchant, full of wine and self-importance, might find that his body is unwilling to follow his desires. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is, quite literally, weak. This was a moment of supreme peril for the courtesan. The man's failure to perform was never, ever his fault. It was hers. Was her perfume not alluring enough? Was her conversation not stimulating? Was her body not sufficiently beautiful? The blame and his subsequent rage would fall squarely on her. His shame and frustration would curdle into aggression. He might accuse her of being a witch, of casting a spell to unman him. He might lash out, physically or verbally, to reclaim his shattered ego. "You ugly hag, you've drained the life from me," he might scream, his face purple with fury. A moment of biological impotence could quickly escalate into a scene of terrifying violence. Fiammetta's job in this scenario was to perform a miracle of emotional jiu-jitsu. She had to absorb his rage and, with superhuman calm, transform it back into flattery. "My lord, your passion is so immense it overwhelms the very stars. A man of your potency cannot be rushed. Let us rest, have more wine. Your strength will return tenfold." It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to soothe the wounded beast before it mauled her. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The room could become a wreck of overturned furniture and shattered glass, all because of a rich man's fragile pride. Then there was the failure of payment. The deal was simple: pleasure for coin. But men, especially powerful men, are not always keen on holding up their end of the bargain. A client might enjoy the services and then, in the cold light of the aftermath, simply refuse to pay. "You should be grateful for the honor of my company," he might sneer, adjusting his doublet as he prepares to leave. This was a catastrophic failure. Fiammetta has invested her time, her energy, and her body. She has endured his clumsiness and his stench. She has risked disease and violence, and now she is to be left with nothing but stained sheets and a fresh layer of shame. What could she do? She had no legal recourse. A whore's contract is not enforceable in any court. She could plead, she could rage, she could beg. But this often only hardened the man's resolve, confirming his power over her. "What are you going to do, little bird? Call the city guard, they know what you are." Her only real weapon was her reputation and his. She could threaten to spread the word among the other courtesans, to brand him as a cheapskate and a cheat, a man without honor. This was a risky move. A powerful man could crush her for such an insult. But sometimes the threat of social humiliation was enough to make him toss a few coins on the bed, in disgust, a fraction of the agreed-upon price, just to shut her up. More often than not, she would have to swallow the loss, adding his name to a mental list of men to be avoided, a list that grew longer and more dangerous with each passing year. The downfall could also be brutally medical. In the middle of an encounter, she might discover the telltale sign of the pox on her client, a weeping sore, a suspicious rash. The discovery was a bolt of pure, cold terror. She is in bed with her own potential death sentence. She has to stop immediately, but how? To recoil in horror would be to insult him, and an insulted man is a dangerous man. She has to invent a reason, a sudden illness, a fabricated emergency. "My lord, forgive me, a sudden ague has seized me. It is the damp night air." She has to extricate herself from the situation without revealing the true reason, all while her mind is screaming. Has he already infected her? Is it too late? After he leaves, a storm of panic ensues. She will scrub herself raw, use her harshest douches, and pray to every saint she knows. She will spend the next weeks in a state of high anxiety, checking her own body obsessively for the first sign of a symptom. The illusion of pleasure is replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of contamination. The bed, her place of work, becomes a crime scene. And sometimes The downfall was simply pathetic. The client might get too drunk and pass out before the act even begins, snoring loudly in a puddle of his own drool. Or worse, he might vomit on her expensive rug. Or he might, in a fit of drunken sentimentality, start weeping uncontrollably about his unhappy marriage or his business failures, forcing her into the role of unpaid therapist. These scenarios were less dangerous but deeply humiliating in their own way. She is left to deal with the cleanup, to try and maneuver an unconscious, heavy man out of her bed and out of her house. She might have to call her servant to help her drag him to the door. This wasn't the glamorous life of a muse. This was the undignified, thankless work of a glorified babysitter for grown men. Each of these failures, from the violent to the pathetic, chipped away at her. They were constant reminders of her precarity. She was not a queen in her castle. She was a service worker whose business could be ruined by a single, disastrous client interaction. Her success was measured not just by the nights that went well, but by her ability to survive the nights that went disastrously, horribly wrong. Each failure was a lesson, written in bruises, lost income, and fear. And the final, most undignified end was the one every courtesan feared most, the failure of her own body. The day she looked in the mirror and saw that the lead paint could no longer hide the wrinkles, that the belladonna couldn't hide the dullness in her eyes, that the wit and charm had been replaced by a weary cynicism. That was the ultimate downfall, the one from which there was no recovery. In this relentless cycle of exploitation and survival, was there any room for agency? Was the courtesan just a passive victim, a beautiful doll passed from one brute to the next? To believe that is to deny her humanity. No, she was not a revolutionary storming the Bastille, but in the small, suffocating confines of her world, she found ways to resist, to push back, to assert her own will. These moments of resistance and failed escapes are what make her story not just a tragedy, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They were often small, petty acts of defiance, but in a life with so little power, a small victory could feel like a revolution. One of the most common forms of resistance was subtle sabotage. A client who was particularly cruel, cheap, or boorish would find his experience subtly degraded. Fiammetta might serve him her worst, watered-down wine. She might give a deliberately uninspired, passionless performance in bed, a lazy whore routine designed to leave him frustrated and unsatisfied. She might accidentally take longer to get ready, wasting his precious paid-for time. These were tiny rebellions, invisible to the man himself, but deeply satisfying to her. It was a way of saying, "You can buy my time, you can rent my body, but you cannot command my spirit." She could steal from him too. A few coins lifted from a purse left carelessly on a chair, a small piece of jewelry pocketed while he was distracted. It was a hazard tax, a bonus she paid herself for enduring his presence. This was incredibly risky. If caught, she could be beaten or turned over to the authorities. But the thrill of getting away with it, of reclaiming a tiny piece of what she was owed, was often worth the risk. A more powerful weapon was gossip. The courtesans of Venice, despite being rivals, formed a loose, informal network. They talked, they shared information. A man who developed a reputation for being violent or for not paying would find himself blacklisted. Doors would suddenly be closed to him. Women would be unavailable when he came to call. This collective action was their version of a union strike. By controlling information, they could exert a surprising amount of influence over the city's sexual economy. They could build a man's reputation or destroy it. A well-placed rumor about a nobleman's shortcomings, whispered in the right ear, could become the talk of the town, a source of public ridicule that would sting far more than the loss of a few ducats. The poems and letters of the literate courtesans were the ultimate form of this resistance. Women like Veronica Franco used their literary skills not just to attract patrons, but to skewer them. In her verses, she could mock a lover's arrogance, expose his hypocrisy, and defend her own honor with a skill that few men could match. Her pen was her sword, and she wielded it with deadly precision. It was a way of having the last word, of transforming her private humiliation into public art. But what about escaping the life altogether? This was the ultimate dream for many, and the most common form of failed escape. The fantasy was always the same, to find a wealthy patron who would fall truly in love with her, who would cast aside his wife and marry her, elevating her to a position of respectability. It was the Cinderella story, retooled for the Venetian canals. And it was almost always a fantasy. A nobleman might be infatuated with his mistress, he might shower her with gifts and promises, but he would almost never marry her. The social barriers were simply too high. His family, his reputation, his inheritance, all of it would be jeopardized by a marriage to a fallen woman. The courtesan was a delightful hobby, but a wife was a strategic alliance. So the woman who believed his promises of love and marriage would inevitably be disappointed. He would use her, enjoy her, and then, when it was time to make a suitable match with the daughter of another powerful family, he would cast her aside. The cast-off mistress was a tragic figure in Venice. She was left with nothing but fading beauty, a tarnished reputation, and a collection of pretty things that she would have to sell to survive. Her attempt to escape through love ended in the most brutal confirmation of her status as a disposable commodity. Sometimes the resistance came from the other side. A customer might have his own crisis of conscience. A young man, perhaps visiting a courtesan for the first time, might be so shocked and disgusted by the cold, transactional reality of the encounter that he would refuse to go through with it. He might see the deadness in her eyes, the practiced smile that didn't reach them, and suddenly see her not as a mythical creature of pleasure, but as a tired, sad woman doing a miserable job. What were the consequences of this? For him, perhaps a bit of teasing from his friends. For her, it was a disaster. It was an insult. It implied that she was not desirable enough, not convincing enough. It was a professional failure. She might even become angry at his sudden display of morality. What, are you too good for me now? You were happy enough to come here. Pay me for my time and get out. His pity was more insulting than another man's lust. It shattered the professional detachment she needed to survive. These moments, when the mask slipped on either side, were the most dangerous. A flicker of real emotion, her rage, his pity, her disgust, could break the unwritten rules of the game. And when the rules were broken, the outcome was unpredictable and often violent. The safest path was to feel nothing, to want nothing, to be nothing but the perfect, pleasing reflection of a man's desire. The moments of resistance were flickers of light in a vast darkness, but they were almost always extinguished, leaving the woman right back where she started, trapped, but for a brief, shining moment, defiant, just when you think the situation can't get any more fraught with tension, degradation, and the quiet hum of despair. History loves to throw in a wild card. The life of a Venetian courtesan was already a high-wire act over a pit of vipers, but often an unexpected element would be introduced that would escalate the chaos, turning a bad night into a life-altering disaster. This wasn't just things going wrong in a predictable way. This was the universe deciding to pour gasoline on the fire and toss in a lit match for good measure. One of the most terrifying wildcard elements was the unexpected arrival. Imagine Fiammetta is in the middle of a delicate and profitable session with Signore Bastiano. The wine is flowing, the lute music is playing, and the transaction is proceeding as planned. Suddenly there's a furious pounding on the door. It's not another client, it's Bastiano's wife. She has followed him. The scene explodes. The carefully constructed boudoir of seduction becomes a battlefield. The wife, a woman of noble birth, who has spent her life in pious seclusion, is now a screaming, vengeful fury. She is not just angry at her husband, her deepest rage is directed at Fiammetta, the painted harlot who has stolen her husband's virtue and his money. She will claw, she will bite, she will scream accusations of witchcraft and damnation. She might try to physically attack Fiammetta, tearing at her hair and clothes. In this scenario, Fiammetta is utterly trapped. Signore Bastiano, the powerful patron, will almost certainly side with his wife. He has to maintain his respectable facade. He will feign shock and horror, pretending Fiammetta seduced him against his will. "This witch bewitched me, my dear. I was powerless," he'll cry, throwing Fiammetta to the wolves to save his own skin. The courtesan is now facing not just the loss of a client, but public scandal, physical assault, and potentially an accusation of witchcraft, which could lead to an investigation by the Inquisition. A single night's work has escalated into a fight for her very life. She might be dragged into the street, shamed before the neighbors, her career in that part of the city ruined forever. The arrival of the wife was a bomb that blew up the entire unspoken contract of Venetian society, the one that said men could have their secrets as long as they were discreet. When that discretion failed, the woman at the bottom of the pyramid always paid the highest price. Another terrifying escalation was the official raid. The city's authorities, the Council of Ten, or the health magistrates, were notoriously unpredictable. For months, they might turn a blind eye to the flourishing sex trade. Then suddenly, often for political reasons or to make a public show of piety, they would crack down. A squadron of the city guard could burst into a courtesan's house at any hour without warning. These raids were brutal and humiliating. They would ransack the place, ostensibly searching for forbidden luxuries like silk or for evidence of heresy. The women would be rounded up, often half-dressed, and subjected to rough handling and lewd insults from the very guards who were likely their clients on other nights. The purpose wasn't always justice, it was intimidation and extortion. A courtesan might be arrested and thrown into a dank cell, only to be released after a hefty fine was paid, either by her or her patron. The raid was a stark reminder of who was really in control. It shattered any illusion of safety or autonomy. One moment she was a queen in her salon, the next she was chattel being manhandled by city employees. And in the chaos of a raid, her clients, the powerful men of Venice, would vanish like smoke, slipping out back doors or hiding in closets, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Perhaps the most horrifying wildcard of all was the arrival of the plague. Venice, as a major port city, was periodically devastated by outbreaks of the Black Death. When the plague hit, the city of pleasure transformed overnight into a city of terror. The carnival atmosphere vanished, replaced by the smell of death and burning herbs. The canals, usually teeming with gondolas, now carried barges piled high with corpses. For a courtesan, the plague was an extinction-level event. Her business relied on intimacy, on close physical contact. In a time of contagion, she became a pariah, a suspected carrier of the disease. Her clients vanished. Her income dried up. She was trapped in a city of the dead, often in a rented room she could no longer afford. The beautiful pale skin she cultivated with lead paint was now a terrifying sign of sickness. Every cough, every fever was a potential death sentence. The authorities, in a desperate attempt to control the spread, would wall up houses where the plague was found, trapping the healthy inside with the dying. A courtesan could find herself sealed in her beautiful apartment, her gilded cage now a literal tomb. She would be left to die alone, surrounded by the useless trinkets of her former life. The plague was the ultimate equalizer. It didn't care if you were a duchess or a whore. It stripped away all the pretense, all the social hierarchy, and revealed the fragile, terrified human underneath. The arrival of the plague was the final, grotesque punchline to a life built on the illusion of beauty and the denial of decay. Sometimes the wild card was more personal, more bizarre. A patron might arrive not for simple pleasure, but with a strange, specific, and dangerous fetish. He might demand a performance that involved blasphemy, forcing her to participate in a black mass or desecrate a religious object. In a city watched over by the Inquisition, this was playing with fire. Refusal could mean violence, compliance could mean being burned at the stake. Or a new rival might arrive in town, a younger, more beautiful courtesan who begins to steal her best clients. Suddenly, it's not just about surviving the night, it's about surviving a ruthless business competition. The escalation could be anything that upset the fragile equilibrium of her life. It was the introduction of an unknown variable into an already volatile equation. And the result was almost always the same. The courtesan, who had the least power and the most to lose, would be the one to suffer the most. Her life was a constant exercise in crisis management, and the wild cards were the crises she could never predict, the ones that could sweep her off the board in a single, terrifying move. The main event is over. The client, be he satisfied, frustrated, or passed out, is gone. The adrenaline of the performance fades, the forced smile drops, and what is left is the quiet, grotesque landscape of the aftermath. This is the part of the job that is never depicted in art, the unglamorous but essential work of cleanup, triage, and accounting. The tone in the room is one of utter exhaustion, a hollowed-out silence punctuated by the distant sounds of the city. The first thing Fiammetta does is bolt the door. For the first time in hours, she is alone. The space that was a theatre of seduction just moments before is now just a dirty room. The air is stale and thick with the lingering smells of sex, spilled wine, and burnt-out candles. It's a smell of depletion, of something finished. Her body, which was a finely tuned instrument of pleasure, is now just a body again, sore, bruised in places and sticky. The immediate fallout is a slow, methodical process of reclaiming herself and her space from the mess the client has left behind. She begins with the money. If he paid, she retrieves the coins, her fingers testing their weight and authenticity. She counts them, her lips moving silently, her mind already calculating. Is it enough for the rent? For the butcher's bill? For the new jar of belladonna she needs? This is the most concrete result of the night's labor, the cold, hard proof that her humiliation had a purpose. She hides the money in a secure place, a loose floorboard, a hollowed-out book. It is her survival, her hope, her entire world, reduced to a small pile of metal. Then comes the physical triage. She inspects her body with a cold, clinical detachment. Are there new bruises, scratches, any signs of a tear or bleeding? She is her own doctor, her own nurse. She goes to her collection of jars and vials, the hidden pharmacy of her trade. She might apply a soothing salve to a patch of chafed skin, or a foul-smelling ointment of her own concoction to a bite mark. The most critical part of this ritual is the clean-up, the desperate attempt to wash away the physical and spiritual residue of the encounter. She will use her basin of water, often cold and murky, to wash herself as best she can. And then comes the internal cleansing, the ritual douching with wine, vinegar, or alum. It stings, it burns, it's a small act of violence she inflicts upon herself in the name of hygiene. She is trying to scour away the man, to erase his scent, his touch, his very presence from the inside of her body. It is a futile, damaging act, but it is a ritual, and rituals are what keep madness at bay. The cleanup extends to the room itself. The bed is a disaster zone. The sheets are stained with wine, sweat, and other bodily fluids. She will strip them, bundling them up to be washed tomorrow by her servant, if she can afford one, or by her own hands in the canal, if she can't. She airs out the lumpy mattress, plumps the pillows, and remakes the bed, transforming the scene of the crime back into a saleable product. She gathers the empty wine glasses, wipes up any spills, and disposes of the detritus of the encounter. It's the work of a janitor, a maid, a scene shifter in the theatre of her own life. This is the moment of greatest vulnerability. The adrenaline is gone, the money is counted, and all that's left is the woman and the quiet, ugly truth of her profession. The emotional fallout hits her like a physical blow. The shame she has held at bay all evening comes flooding in. The disgust, the self-loathing, the bone-deep weariness. She might catch her reflection in the polished metal mirror and see not the beautiful courtesan, but a pale, exhausted woman with hollow eyes. The lead paint on her face now looks like a clown's mask, cracked and smeared. She might sit on the edge of her newly made bed and weep, not loud, histrionic sobs, but silent, bitter tears of exhaustion and despair. Or she might feel nothing at all, a profound, terrifying numbness, a hollowness in her chest where feelings used to be. This numbness is a survival mechanism, a form of psychological armor. To feel the full weight of her reality every single night would be unbearable, so she shuts it down. She becomes a ghost in her own life, going through the motions with a professional detachment that is both her greatest strength and her most profound tragedy. The aftermath is also a time for looting, in a sense. Did the client leave anything behind? A forgotten glove? A handkerchief? If it's of any value, it's hers now. A small, undeclared bonus. This is part of the grim economy of her world, where every scrap has value. She is a scavenger, picking through the wreckage of the evening for anything that can be used or sold. The immediate fallout is a slow return to a baseline of solitude and self-possession. It's about washing the man off her skin, cleaning his mess from her room, and trying to patch up the small tears in her body and her soul. It's a lonely, thankless, and endlessly repeated task. And as she finally blows out the last candle and lies down in her clean but still haunted bed, she knows that in a few hours the sun will rise and she will have to begin the entire soul-crushing process all over again. The preparation, the performance, the pathetic climax, and the hollow aftermath. It is a wheel, and she is chained to it. The only peace she gets is in these few dark hours of exhaustion, a brief, dreamless ceasefire in the long, grinding war of her life. The night is over, the client is gone, the room is clean, but the encounter leaves behind more than just stained sheets and a few extra coins. It leaves scars, not just the physical bruises that will fade, but the deep, invisible wounds on the psyche. The lingering trauma of this life is a slow-acting poison, a gradual erosion of the soul that is far more devastating than any disease of the body. How does a woman process this kind of trauma, day in and day out? How does she cope with a reality that is built on the foundation of her own objectification and debasement? The answer is a complex and tragic cocktail of coping mechanisms ranging from black humor to emotional numbness to self-destruction. One of the most common survival tools was a profound and bitter cynicism. The courtesan develops a worldview in which everything and everyone is for sale. Love is a fantasy for poets and fools. Honor is a word rich men use to justify their crimes. Piety is a mask for hypocrisy. This cynicism is a shield. If you believe in nothing, you can't be disappointed. If you trust no one, you can't be betrayed. She sees the world for what it is, a brutal marketplace, and in that marketplace, she is a merchant, selling a perishable good. Her conversations with other courtesans would be laced with this dark, sardonic humor. They would trade stories of their most ridiculous clients, mocking their flaws, their pretensions, their sexual inadequacies. This shared laughter was a form of therapy, a way of turning their shared trauma into a joke. By laughing at the men who used them, they reclaimed a small measure of power. They could transform a powerful, terrifying senator into a pathetic figure with a small penis and bad breath. In their private conversations, the power dynamics of the city were inverted. The men were the fools, and the women were the wise, weary survivors who saw through all the bullshit. But this cynical armor is heavy, and over time it fuses to the skin. The professional detachment required for the job begins to bleed into every aspect of her life. The ability to feign emotion for a client eventually leads to an inability to feel genuine emotion at all. She might find herself unable to form real attachments, to trust, to love. Every interaction becomes transactional. Every relationship is assessed in terms of profit and loss. The numbness that protects her during the work becomes her default state. She is an actress who has forgotten how to take off the mask. She is surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. This emotional cauterization is one of the deepest scars of the profession. She has traded her capacity for genuine human connection for a handful of silver, and in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, the weight of that bargain can become crushing. The loneliness of the successful courtesan was a specific, poignant kind of hell, a crowded room where no one sees the real you. To numb this profound emotional pain, many turned to more tangible comforts. Alcohol was a constant companion, a glass of wine to steady the nerves before a client, another to dull the senses during, and several more to wash away the memory after. The line between social drinking and functional alcoholism was blurry and easily crossed. The wine that was a prop in her seduction became a crutch for her survival. Opiates, in the form of laudanum or other tinctures, were also readily available from the local apothecary. They offered a swift, blissful escape from the pain of the body and the soul. A few drops could transport her to a hazy, dreamlike state where the sordor of her reality could not touch her. But this escape came at a steep price. Addiction was common, another chain to bind her. The very substance she used to cope with the horrors of her job became another horror in itself, draining her money, her health, and her will. The image of the languid, dreamy courtesan reclining on a divan might not be one of romantic ennui, but of a woman, half sedated, escaping into an opium haze. The trauma also manifested in a constant, gnawing anxiety about the future. A courtesan's career was brutally short. Her only capital was her beauty and her youth, and both were fleeting. Every new wrinkle, every grey hair was a sign of her impending obsolescence. She lived with the terrifying knowledge that she was a depreciating asset. This created a frantic need to earn as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to save for the inevitable day when she would no longer be desirable. But the expenses of her lifestyle, the lavish clothes, the expensive apartment, the endless cosmetics, made saving nearly impossible. Most courtesans were trapped in a cycle of debt, always one step behind, forever trying to maintain an illusion of wealth that was costing them their future. The psychological toll of this financial precarity was immense. It was a constant, low-level panic that hummed beneath the surface of every glamorous party, every witty conversation. What will happen to me when I am old? This was the question that haunted her dreams. The answer was usually grim. An old, cast-off courtesan had few options. She might become a procuress, a bitter old crone who now profits from the exploitation of younger women. She might end her days in a convent for reformed prostitutes, living a life of penance and prayer. Or, most commonly, she would die in poverty and squalor, forgotten by the very men who had once showered her with gold. The psychological scars of the life were a life sentence. The cynicism, the numbness, the addiction, the anxiety, these were the true costs of being a queen of the night. She may have survived the pox, the violence, and the heartbreak, but she could not escape the prison of her own mind, a mind that had been trained to see the world as a transaction and herself as the goods. The laughter with her friends was real, but the silence that followed was the truer testament to her condition. The trauma wasn't contained within the perfumed walls of the courtesan's apartment. It seeped out like the damp from the canals and had profound, far-reaching effects on Venetian society as a whole. The widespread, semi-sanctioned nature of high-class prostitution created ripples that touched everything from public health to the city's economy to its legal system. This wasn't just a series of private sins, it was a public institution with massive, often devastating, societal consequences. Let's start with the most obvious and terrifying ripple: disease. The French pox, syphilis, was the great plague of the Renaissance, and Venice, as a bustling international port and a hub of the sex trade, was an epicenter of the pandemic. The disease cut a terrifying swathe through every level of society. It began in the brothels and bedrooms of the courtesans, but it didn't stay there. The nobleman who contracted it from his mistress would bring it home to his wife, who might then pass it on to her unborn children, resulting in congenital syphilis, a horrific condition that caused deformities, blindness, and early death. The disease respected no social boundaries. Popes, cardinals, kings, and artists all fell victim to it. The city's attempts to control it were a tragic farce. The provveditori alla sanità, the health magistrates, were more concerned with maintaining order and revenue than with actual public health. Their inspections of prostitutes were often just another opportunity for harassment and extortion. The cures were a public health crisis in themselves. Quack doctors and charlatans peddled all sorts of useless and dangerous remedies. The most famous, of course, was mercury. The agonizing salivation cure became a common sight. Men and women would be confined to stuffy, overheated rooms for weeks, ingesting mercury until they drooled uncontrollably, their teeth loosened, and their gums rotted. Many died from the cure, not the disease. The physical landscape of the city was marked by the pox. People with the telltale signs, a collapsed saddle nose from the cartilage rotting away, deep scars on the face, were common sights. The disease created a culture of fear and suspicion where intimacy was fraught with mortal danger. The beautiful, seductive world of the Venetian courtesan was, in reality, a primary vector for a devastating epidemic that left a trail of madness, disfigurement, and death in its wake. The economic impact was just as profound. In a twisted way, the sex trade was one of the pillars of the Venetian economy. It was a massive industry that employed not just the women themselves, but a whole ecosystem of supporting businesses. There were the landlords who rented out the expensive apartments, the servants who cleaned them, the gondoliers who provided discreet transport. There were the merchants who sold the silk, the perfume, and the jewels. There were the wine sellers, the musicians, the doctors, and the apothecaries. A significant portion of the city's commerce was in some way connected to this trade in flesh. The government, as we've noted, was a direct beneficiary. They levied specific taxes on courtesans, treating their earnings as a legitimate, if morally questionable, source of state revenue. This created a deep structural hypocrisy. The city's leaders would publicly decry the immorality of it all, while privately their accountants were rubbing their hands with glee at the income pouring into the state's coffers. The money generated by prostitution helped fund the city's wars, its public works, and the lavish lifestyles of its ruling class. The beauty of Venice, the stunning art and architecture that we still admire today, was paid for, in part, by the exploitation of thousands of women. St. Mark's Basilica might as well have a plaque that reads, "Funded by Sin." This visible, profitable industry led to a constant social and legal struggle. The city was in a perpetual state of moral panic. Religious reformers and fiery priests like Girolamo Savonarola, in nearby Florence, but his influence was felt everywhere, thundered from the pulpit, calling for a crackdown on the city's rampant sinfulness. This led to the creation of an endless stream of laws designed to regulate and control the courtesans. The sumptuary laws dictating their dress were constantly being revised and reissued, a sign of their utter ineffectiveness. There were laws attempting to confine them to certain districts, like the infamous harem district, effectively creating a red-light ghetto. But the high-class courtesans, with their wealthy patrons, almost always managed to live wherever they pleased. These laws were a form of social theatre, a way for the state to look like it was doing something about the problem, while doing very little to disrupt the profitable status quo. This created a legal grey area where the women lived, a space where they were simultaneously tolerated and criminalized, taxed and persecuted. And what about the next generation? The children born from these encounters were the ultimate, tragic ripple effect. An unwanted pregnancy was a disaster for a courtesan, but they happened. While abortion was a common, if dangerous, resort, some children were brought to term. What was their fate? They were the living evidence of a sin that society wanted to keep hidden. Most were abandoned, left on the steps of a church, or at the door of one of the city's orphanages, the ospedali. These institutions, while providing a basic level of care, were often harsh, overcrowded places. The children grew up with the stigma of their birth, marked as the sons and daughters of whores. A male child might be lucky enough to be apprenticed into a trade, but a female child was often groomed to follow in her mother's footsteps, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. The very orphanages designed to save these children often became recruiting grounds for the next generation of prostitutes. The system fed on itself, creating a permanent hereditary underclass of women whose bodies were the raw material for the city's economic and sexual needs. The societal ripple effect was a vicious circle of hypocrisy, disease, and exploitation, where the profits flowed upward to the rich and powerful, and the costs, in blood, pain, and shame, were paid by the women and children at the very bottom. So, after all the grime, the disease, the exploitation, and the quiet despair, how do we end up with the romantic, glamorous myth of the Venetian courtesan? The answer lies in the human genius for rewriting history, for taking a brutal reality and polishing it until it shines. The bitter legacy of the courtesan is not the truth of her suffering, but the beautiful, intoxicating lie that replaced it. This process of historical sanitization began even as the women themselves were living and dying. It was a conscious act of rebranding, driven by the very people involved. The courtesans themselves, especially the literate ones, were the first architects of their own myth. When Veronica Franco wrote her defiant sonnets, she wasn't just expressing her feelings, she was crafting a public persona. She presented herself not as a victim, but as a witty, powerful intellectual who chose her life and navigated it with skill and grace. She wrote of love, beauty, and philosophical debates, not of mercury salves, drunken clients, and the constant fear of the pot. Her poetry was a form of marketing, an advertisement for the idea of the honest courtesan. It was a brilliant strategy for survival, a way to elevate her status and her price. But in doing so, she helped create a fantasy that would obscure the reality for centuries to come. Her beautiful words became a veil, hiding the ugly truth of the profession for the thousands of women who couldn't write their way out of it. The male patrons were just as complicit in this myth-making. The writers and artists of the era, men like Pietro Aretino, wrote dialogues and plays that celebrated the wit and charm of the courtesan. They depicted her as a muse, a source of inspiration, a worthy intellectual sparring partner. Why? Because it flattered them. It recast their own sordid visits to a prostitute as a noble pursuit of art and culture. It was far more palatable to tell oneself and to tell the world that you were the patron of a brilliant female poet than to admit you were just another man paying for sex. The paintings of artists like Titian and Veronese further cemented this myth. They painted courtesans as goddesses, as Venus, as flora, as idealized beauties draped in silk and jewels. They captured the fantasy, not the reality. You will never see a Titian painting of a courtesan weeping as she applies a mercury ointment to a syphilitic sore. You will not see a Veronese masterpiece depicting a drunken merchant vomiting on a priceless carpet. They painted the product, the advertisement, the lie. And because art endures, this beautiful lie is what has survived. It hangs in our museums, a silent, powerful testament to a reality that never truly existed. As the centuries passed, the story got even more sanitized. The rise of Romanticism in the 19th century seized upon the figure of the courtesan as a symbol of tragic, forbidden love and female rebellion. She became a stock character in operas and novels, a beautiful, doomed creature who loves freely and dies beautifully, usually of consumption, which was seen as a much more poetic illness than, say, syphilis. The grime was washed away, replaced by a soft, focused glow of tragic glamour. The complex, cynical businesswoman was transformed into a simple, passionate heroine. The economic realities, the brutal exploitation, the sheer, grinding misery of the job, all of it was written out of the script. We were left with a story that was much more comfortable, much more entertaining, and much less true. We remember the names of a few exceptional women like Veronica Franco or Gaspara Stampa, and we project their success onto the entire class. We forget the 11,000 anonymous others who lived and died in obscurity, whose names are not recorded in any book of poetry, but perhaps only in a tax ledger or the grim records of a plague hospital. We have chosen to remember the dream and forget the nightmare. This rewriting of history is a profound act of societal forgetting. It allows us to look back on a period of intense, systemic exploitation and see only beauty and romance. It's a way of absolving the past of its sins. We tell ourselves that these women were empowered, that they were in control, because the alternative, that a celebrated, beautiful culture was built on the backs of suffering women, is too uncomfortable to confront. It's the same impulse that romanticizes the Old South while ignoring the horrors of slavery, or glorifies the Wild West while forgetting the genocide of native peoples. We cherry-pick the parts of history that make us feel good and discard the rest. The bitter legacy of the Venetian courtesan is this sanitized myth, a story of a powerful, witty muse who held senators and artists captive with her charm. A lie that is so beautiful, so seductive, that we still buy it today. It's a legacy that erases the pain of the real women and replaces it with a hollow, gilded fantasy. It is the final, most profound act of exploitation, not just to use a woman's body, but to steal her story and replace it with one that serves the powerful. The real woman is gone, and only the beautiful, silent ghost of the myth remains. So, we end where we began, with the lie. The perfectly crafted, beautifully preserved lie of the empowered Venetian courtesan, a witty intellectual in silk who navigated the world with a sonnet and a smile. We've peeled it back, looked at the festering reality underneath, the poison, the poverty, the pox, the powerlessness. We've seen how the brutal, transactional reality of her life was methodically scrubbed clean and rewritten into a romantic fable, a piece of historical propaganda that makes us feel better about a system built on exploitation. It's a comfortable, beautiful story. And it's easy to look back with a sense of detached, modern superiority and cluck our tongues at the hypocrisy of those 16th century Venetians, those men who praised the Virgin Mary in public and paid for a whore in private. It's easy to condemn them for their cruelty, their blindness, their ability to romanticize their own filth. But here's the final, bleak punchline. Are we really any different? Let's take a good hard look in the modern mirror. We've traded the palazzo for the platform, the patron for the follower, the ducat for the like. We live in a world of digital courtesans, a world of influencers, and content creators who monetize their personalities, their bodies, their very lives for our consumption. They construct a perfect curated fantasy of beauty, wealth, and happiness, and they sell it to us piece by piece. They perform a modern version of the cortigiana onesta, offering a fantasy of intimacy and connection. They are witty, they are beautiful, they are always on. They show us the glamorous front room, the perfect avocado toast, the exotic vacation, the flawless makeup. They are masters of their own myth-making. But what about the back room? What about the grinding, relentless pressure to perform, to stay relevant, to feed the algorithm that is their new, faceless patron? What about the anxiety, the depression, the eating disorders, the body dysmorphia that festers behind the perfect smile and the flattering filter? What about the slow, soul-crushing process of turning your entire self into a marketable brand until you're not sure where the real you ends and the product begins? They are selling an illusion of a perfect life, and the cost, just like for Fiammetta, is often their own mental and emotional health. They are poisoning themselves, not with lead paint, but with the toxic pressure of perpetual performance. And we, the audience, are the new patrons. We consume their lives, we judge their authenticity, we demand more content, and our collective attention is the currency that determines their survival. We are the Signore Bastiano scrolling through our phones, demanding to be entertained, titillated, and distracted, rarely considering the human cost of the fantasy we are being sold. The system is the same. The powerful consume the lives of the beautiful for their own pleasure and profit, and the entire enterprise is wrapped in a beautiful, seductive lie. The lie that it's empowering, the lie that it's a choice, the lie that it's not just a transaction. So before we get too smug about the past, before we write off the Venetian courtesan as a relic of a barbaric age, maybe we should ask ourselves one final, uncomfortable question. We still pay to watch beautiful people pretend to be happy for our entertainment, don't we? What, you thought that was new? You thought that